Ring. Stephen Baxter. Part 1. Event System. Even at the moment she was born, she knew something was wrong. A face loomed over her, wide, smooth, smiling. The cheeks were damp, the glistening eyes huge. Liesl. Oh, Liesl. Liesl. My name, then. She explored the face before her, studying the lines around the eyes, the humorous upturn of the mouth, the strong nose. It was an intelligent, lived-in face. This is a good human being, she thought. Good stock. Good stock. This was impossible. She was impossible. She felt terrified of her own explosive consciousness. She shouldn't even be able to focus her eyes yet. She tried to touch her mother's face. Her own hand was still moist with amniotic fluid, but it was growing visibly, the bones extending and broadening, filling out the loose skin as if it were a glove. She opened her mouth. It was dry, her gums already sore with budding teeth. Strong arms reached beneath her, bony adult fingers dug into the aching flesh of her back. She could sense other adults surrounding her, the bed in which she'd been born, the outlines of a room. Her mother held her high before a window. Liesl's head lolled, the expanding muscles still too weak to support the burgeoning weight of her skull. Spittle laced across her chin. An immense light flooded her eyes. She cried out. Her mother enfolded her in her arms. The sun, Liesl. The sun. The first few days were the worst. Her parents, impossibly tall, looming figures, took her through brightly lit rooms, a garden always flooded with sunlight. She learned to sit up. The muscles in her back fanned out, pulsing as they grew. To distract her from the unending pain, clowns tumbled over the grass before her, chortling through huge red lips, before popping out of existence in clouds of pixels. She grew explosively, feeding all the time, a million impressions crowding into her soft sensorium. There seemed to be no limit to the number of rooms in this place, this house. Slowly she began to understand that some of the rooms were virtual chambers. Blank screens against which any number of images could be projected. But even so, the house must comprise hundreds of rooms. And she, with her parents, wasn't alone here. There were other people. But at first they kept away, out of sight, apparent only by their actions, the meals they prepared, the toys they left her. On the third day her parents took her on a trip by flitter. It was the first time she'd been away from the house, its grounds. As the flitter rose she stared through the bulbous windows, pressing her nose to heated glass. The house was a jumble of white, cube-shaped buildings, linked by corridors, and surrounded by garden, grass, trees. Further out there were bridges and roads, looping through the air above the ground, more houses like a child's bricks, sprinkled across glowing hillsides. The flitter soared higher. The journey was an arc over a toy-like landscape. A breast of blue ocean curved away from the land, all around her. This was the island of Skyros, Philida. Her mother told her, and the sea was called the Aegean. The house was the largest construct on the island. She could see huge, brown-painted spheres dotting the heart of the island, carbon sequestration domes, Philida said, balls of dry ice 400 yards tall. The flitter snuggled at last against a grassy sward close to the shore of the ocean. Liesl's mother lifted her out and placed her, on her stretching, unsteady legs, on the rough, sandy grass. Hand in hand, the little family walked down a short slope to the beach. The sun burned from an unbearably blue sky. Her vision seemed telescopic. She looked at distant groups of children and adults playing, far away, halfway to the horizon, and it was as if she was among them herself. Her feet, still uncertain, pressed into gritty, moist sand. She found mussels clinging to a ruined pier. She prized them away with a toy spade, and gazed, fascinated, at their slime-dripping feet. She could taste the brine salt on the air. It seemed to permeate her very skin. She sat on the sand with her parents, feeling her light costume stretch over her still spreading limbs. They played a simple game of counters, moving over a floating virtual board, with pictures of ladders and hissing snakes. There was laughter, mock complaints by her father, elaborate pantomimes of cheating. Her senses were electric. It was a wonderful day, full of light and joy. Extraordinarily vivid sensations. Her parents loved her. She could see that in the way they moved with each other, came to her, played with her. They must know she was different, but they didn't seem to care. She didn't want to be different, to be wrong. She closed her mind against her fears, and concentrated on the snakes, the ladders, the sparkling counters. Every morning she woke up in a bed that felt too small. Lisa liked the garden. She liked to watch the flowers straining their tiny, pretty faces towards the sun, as the great light climbed patiently across the sky. The sunlight made the flowers grow, her father told her. Maybe she was like a flower, she thought, growing too quickly in all this sunlight. The house was full of toys, colorful blocks, and puzzles, and dolls. She picked them up and turned them over in her stretching, growing hands. She rapidly became bored with each toy, but one little gadget held her attention. It was a tiny village immersed in a globe of water. There were tiny people in there, frozen in mid-step as they walked, or ran, through their world. When her awkward hands shook the globe, plastic snowflakes would swirl through the air, settling over the encased streets and rooftops. She stared at the entombed villagers, wishing she could become one of them, become frozen in time as they were, free of this pressure of growing. On the 5th day she was taken to a wide, irregularly shaped, sunlight-drenched classroom. This room was full of children, other children. The children sat on the floor and played with paints and dolls, or talked earnestly to brilliantly colored virtual figures, smiling birds, tiny clowns. The children turned to watch as she came in with her mother, their faces round and bright, like dapples of sunlight through leaves. She'd never been so close to other children before. Were these children different too? One small girl scowled at her, and Lisa quailed against her mother's legs. But Phillida's familiar warm hands pressed into her back. Go ahead. It's all right. As she stared at the unknown girl's scowling face, Lisa's questions, her too adult, too sophisticated doubts, seemed to evaporate. Suddenly, all that mattered to her, all that mattered in the world, was that she should be accepted by these children, that they wouldn't know she was different. An adult approached her, a man, young, thin, his features bland with youth. He wore a jumpsuit colored a ludicrous orange. In the sunlight, the glow of it shone up over his chin. He smiled at her. Lisa, isn't it? My name's Paul. We're glad you're here. Aren't we, people? He was answered by a rehearsed, chorused yes. Now come and we'll find something for you to do, Paul said. He led her across the child-littered floor to a space beside a small boy. The boy, red-haired, with startling blue eyes, was staring at a virtual puppet which endlessly formed and reformed, the figure two, collapsing into two snowflakes, two swans, two dancing children, the figure three, followed by three bears, three fish swimming in the air, three cakes. The boy mouthed the numbers, following the tinny voice of the virtual 2. 1. 2 and 1 is 3. Paul introduced her to the boy, Tommy, and she sat down with him. Tommy, she was relieved to find, was so fascinated by his virtual that he scarcely seemed aware that Lisa was present, let alone different. Tommy was resting on his stomach, his chin cupped in his palms. Liesl awkwardly copied his posture. The number virtual ran through its cycle. Bye-bye, Tommy. Goodbye, Liesl. It winked out of existence. Now Tommy turned to her, without appraisal, merely looking, with unconscious acceptance. Liesl said, "Can we see that again?" He yawned and stuck a finger into one nostril. "No. Let's see another. There's a great one about the Precambrian explosion." "The what?" He waved a hand dismissively. "You know, the Burgess Shale and all that. Wait till you see hallucinogenia crawling over your neck." The children played, and learned, and napped. Later, the girl who'd scowled at Liesl, Ginny, started some trouble. She poked fun at the way Liesl's bony wrist stuck out of her sleeves. Liesl's growth rate was slowing, but she was still expanding out of her clothes each day. Then, unexpectedly, astonishingly, Ginny started to bawl, claiming that Liesl had walked through her virtual. When Paul came over, Liesl started to explain, calmly and rationally, that Ginny must be mistaken, but Paul told her not to cause such distress, and for punishment she was forced to sit away from the other children for 10 minutes. Without stimulation, it was all desperately, savagely unfair. It was the longest 10 minutes of Liesl's life. She glowered at Ginny, filled with resentment. The next day she found herself looking forward to going to the room with the children again. She set off with her mother through sunlit corridors. They reached the room. Liesl remembered. There was Paul, smiling a little wistfully to her, and Tommy, and the girl Ginny, but Ginny seemed different, childlike, and formed. At least a head shorter than Liesl. Liesl tried to recapture that delicious enmity of the day before, but it vanished even as she conjured it. Ginny was just a kid. She felt as if something had been stolen from her. Her mother squeezed her hand. "Come on. Let's find a new room for you to play in." Every day was unique. Every day Liesl spent in a new place, with new people. The world glowed with sunlight. Shining points trailed endlessly across the sky, low-orbit habitats and comet nuclei, tethered for power and fuel. People walked through a sea of information, with access to the virtual libraries available anywhere in the world, at a sub-vocalized command. The landscapes were drenched with sentience. It was practically impossible to get lost, or be hurt, or even to become bored. On the 9th day, Liesl steadied herself in a virtual hollow mirror. She had the image turn around, so she could see the shape of her skull, the lie of her hair. There was still some childish softness in her face, she thought, but the woman inside her was emerging already, as if her childhood was a receding tide. She would look like Philly in the strong-nosed set of her face, her large, vulnerable eyes, but she would have the sandy coloring of her father, George. Liesl looked about 9 years old. But she was just 9 days old. She bade the virtual breakup. It shattered into a million tiny, fly-sized images of her face which drifted away in the sunlit air. Philida and George were fine parents, she thought. They were physicists, and they both belonged to an organization they called Paradoxa. They spent their time away from her working through technical papers, which scrolled through the year like falling leaves, and exploring elaborate, onion ring virtual models of stars. Although they were both clearly busy, they gave themselves to her without hesitation. She moved in a happy world of smiles, sympathy and support. Her parents loved her unreservedly. But that wasn't always enough. She started to come up with complicated, detailed questions. Like, what was the mechanism by which she was growing so rapidly? She didn't seem to eat more than the other children she encountered. What could be fueling her absurd growth rate? How did she know so much? She'd been born self-aware, with even the rudiments of language in her head. The virtuals she interacted with in the classrooms were fun, and she always seemed to learn something new, but she absorbed no more than scraps of knowledge through the virtuals compared to the feast of insight with which she awoke each morning. What had taught her in the womb? What was teaching her now? The strange little family had worked up some simple, homely rituals together. Lee Searle's favorite was the game each evening of snakes and ladders. George brought home an old set, a real board made of card and wood encounters. Already Lee Searle was too old for the game, but she loved the company of her parents, her father's elaborate jokes, the simple challenge of the game, the feel of the worn, antique counters. Phillida showed her how to use virtuals to produce her own game boards. Her first efforts, on her 11th day, were plain, neat forms, little more than copies of the commercial boards she'd seen. But soon she began to experiment. She drew a huge board of 1,000,000 squares. It covered a whole room. She could walk through the board, a plainer sheet of light at about waist height. She crammed the board with intricate, curling snakes, vast ladders, vibrantly glowing squares, detail piled on detail. The next morning she walked with eagerness to the room where she'd built her board, and was immediately disappointed. Her efforts seemed pale, static, derivative, obviously the work of a child, despite the assistance of the virtual software. She wiped the board clean, leaving a grid of pale squares floating in the air. Then she started to populate it again, but this time with animated half-human snakes, slithering ladders, of 100 forms. She'd learned to access the virtual libraries, and she plundered the art and history of 100 centuries to populate her board. Of course, it was no longer possible to play games on the board, but that didn't matter. The board was the thing, a world in itself. She withdrew a little from her parents, spending long hours and deep searches through the libraries. She gave up her daily classes. Her parents didn't seem to mind. They came to speak to her regularly, and showed an interest in her projects, but they respected her privacy. The board kept her interest the next day. But now she evolved elaborate games, dividing the board into countries and empires with arbitrary bands of glowing light. Armies of ladder folk joined with legions of snakes and crude recreations of the great events of human history. She watched the symbols flicker across the virtual board, shimmering, coalescing. She dictated lengthy chronicles of the histories of her imaginary countries. By the end of the day, though, she was starting to grow more interested in the history texts she was consulting than in her own elaborations on them. She went to bed, eager for the next morning to come. She awoke in darkness, doubled in agony. She called for light. She sat up in bed. Blood spotted the sheets. She screamed. Phillida sat with her, cradling her head. Lee Searle pressed herself against her mother's warmth, trying to still her trembling. "I think it's time you asked me your questions." Single quote. Lee Searle sniffed. "What questions?" Single quote. "The ones you've carried around with you since the moment you were born." Single quote. Phillida smiled. "I could see it in your eyes, even at that moment. You poor thing. To be burdened with so much awareness." "I'm sorry, Lee Searle." Single quote. Lee Searle pulled away. Suddenly she felt cold, vulnerable. "Who am I, Phillida?" "You're my daughter." Phillida placed her hands on Lee Searle's shoulders and pushed her face close. Lee Searle could feel the warmth of her breath, and the soft room light caught the gray in her mother's blonde hair, making it shine. "Never forget that. You're as human as I am. But she hesitated. But what? But you're being engineered. There are nanobots in your body, Phillida said. Do you understand what a nanobot is? A machine at the molecular level which... I know what a nanobot is, Liesel snapped. I know all about antisenescence. And nanobots. I'm not a child, Mother. Of course not, Phillida said seriously. But in your case, my darling, the nanobots have been programmed not to reverse aging, but to accelerate it. Do you understand? Single quote. Nanobots swarmed through Liesel's body. They plated calcium over her bones, stimulated the generation of new cells, forced her body to sprout like some absurd human sunflower. They even implanted memories, artificial learning, directly into her cortex. Liesel felt like scraping at her skin, gouging out this artificial infection. Why? Why did you let this be done to me? Single quote. Phillida pulled her close, but Liesel stayed stiff, resisting mutely. Phillida buried her face in Liesel's hair. Liesel felt the soft weight of her mother's cheek on the crown of her head. Not yet, Phillida said. Not yet. A few more days, my love. That's all. Phillida's cheeks grew warmer, as if she were crying, silently, into her daughter's hair. Liesel returned to her snakes and ladders board. She found herself looking on her creation with affection, but also nostalgic sadness. She felt distant from this elaborate, slightly obsessive concoction. Already she'd outgrown it. She walked into the middle of the sparkling board and bade a sun, a foot wide, rise out from the center of her body. Light swamped the board, shattering it. She wasn't the only adolescent who had constructed fantasy worlds like this. She read about the Brontes, in their lonely parsonage in the north of England, and their elaborate shared world of kings and princes and empires. And she read about the history of the humble game of snakes and ladders. The game had come from India, where it was a morality teaching aid called Moksha Patamu. There were 12 vices and 4 virtues, and the objective was to get to nirvana. It was easier to fail than to succeed. The British in the 19th century had adopted the game as an instructional guide for children called Kismet. Liesel stared at images of claustrophobic boards, forbidding snakes. 13 snakes and 8 letters showed children that if they were good and obedient, their life would be rewarded. But by a few decades later, the game had lost its moral subtexts. Liesel found images from the early 20th century of a sad-looking little clown who clambered heroically up ladders and slithered haplessly down snakes. The game, with its charm and simplicity, had survived through the 20 centuries which had worn away since the death of that forgotten clown. Liesel stared at him, trying to understand the appeal of his baggy trousers, walking cane, and little mustache. She grew interested in the numbers embedded in the various versions of the game. The 12-to-4 ratio of Moksha Patamu clearly made it a harder game to win than Kismet's 13-to-8, but how much harder? She began to draw new boards in the air. But these boards were abstractions. Clean, colorless, little more than sketches. She ran through high-speed simulated games, studying their outcomes. She experimented with ratios of snakes to ladders, with their placement. Phillida sat with her and introduced her to combinatorial mathematics, the theory of games, to different forms of wonder. On her 15th day she tired of her own company and started to attend classes again. She found the perceptions of others a refreshing counterpoint to her own high-speed learning. The world seemed to open up around her like a flower. It was a world full of sunlight, of endless avenues of information, of stimulating people. She read up on nanobots. She learned the secret of anti-senescence, the process which had rendered humans effectively immortal. Body cells were programmed to commit suicide. Left alone, a cell manufactured enzymes which cut its own DNA into neat pieces, and quietly closed itself down. The suicide of cells was a guard against uncontrolled growth, tumors, and a tool to sculpt the developing body. In the womb, for example, the withering of unwanted cells carved fingers and toes from blunt tissue buds. Death was the default state of a cell. Chemical signals had to be sent out by the body to instruct cells to remain alive. It was a dead man switch control mechanism. If cells grew out of control, or if they separated from their parent organ and wandered through the body, the reassuring environment of chemical signals would be lost, and they would be forced to die. The nanotechnological manipulation of this process made anti-senescence simple. It also made simple the manufacture of a Lieserl. Lieserl studied this, scratching absently at her inhabited, engineered arms. She looked up the word paradoxa in the virtual libraries. She had access to no plausible reference to it. She wasn't an expert at data mining, but she thought there was a hole here. Information about paradoxa was being kept from her. With a boy called Matthew, from her class, she took a trip away from the house. Without her parents, for the first time. They rode a flitter to the shore where she'd played as a child, 12 days earlier. She found the broken pier where she'd discovered mussels. The place seemed less vivid, less magical, and she felt a sad nostalgia for the loss of the freshness of her childish senses. She wondered why no adult ever commented on this dreadful loss of acuity. Perhaps they just forgot, she thought. But there were other compensations. Her body was strong, lithe, and the sunlight was like warm oil on her skin. She ran and swam, relishing the sparkle of the ozone-laden air in her lungs. She and Matthew mock wrestled and chased in the surf, clambering over each other. Like children, she thought, but not quite with complete innocence. As sunset approached, they allowed the flitter to return them to the house. They agreed to meet the next day, perhaps take another trip somewhere. Matthew kissed her lightly, on the lips, as they parted. That night she could barely sleep. She lay in the dark of her room, the scent of salt still strong in her nostrils, the image of Matthew alive in her mind. Her body seemed to pulse with hot blood, with its endless, continuing growth. The next day, her 16th, Lieserl rose quickly. She'd never felt so alive. Her skin still glowed from the salt and sunlight of the shore, and there was a hot tension inside her, an ache deep in her belly, a tightness. When she reached the flitter bay at the front of the house, Matthew was waiting for her. His back was turned, the low sunlight causing the fine hairs at the base of his neck to glow. He turned to face her. He reached out to her, uncertainly, then allowed his hands to drop to his sides. He didn't seem to know what to say. His posture changed, subtly, his shoulders slumping slightly. Before her eyes he was becoming shy of her. She was taller than him, visibly older. She became abruptly aware of the still childlike roundness of his face, the awkwardness of his manner. The thought of touching him, the memory of her feverish dreams during the night, seemed absurd, impossibly adolescent. She felt the muscles in her neck tighten. She felt as if she must scream. Matthew seemed to recede from her, as if she were viewing him through a tunnel. Once again the laboring nanobots, the vicious, unceasing technological infection of her body, had taken away part of her life. This time, though, it was too much to bear. Phillida had never looked so old. Her skin seemed drawn tight across the bones of her face, the lines edged deep. "I'm sorry," she said. "Believe me, When George and I, volunteered for Paradox's program, we knew it would be painful. But we never dreamed how much. Neither of us had children before. Perhaps if we had, we'd have been able to anticipate how this would feel. I'm a freak, an absurd experiment, Lieserl shouted. A construct. Why did you make me human? Why not some insentient animal? Why not a virtual single quote? Oh, you had to be human. As human as possible. Single quote. I'm human in fragments, Lieserl said bitterly. In shards. Which are taken away from me as soon as they're found. That's not humanity, Phillida. It's grotesque. I know. I'm sorry, my love. Come with me. Where? Outside. To the garden. I want to show you something. Suspicious, hostile, Lieserl allowed her mother to take her hand, but she made her fingers lie lifeless, cold in Phillida's warm grasp. It was mid-morning now. The sun's light flooded the garden, flowers, white and yellow, strained up towards the sky. Lieserl looked around, the garden was empty. What am I supposed to be seeing? Single quote. Phillida, solemnly, pointed upwards. Lieserl tilted back her head, shading her eyes to block out the sun. The sky was a searing blue dome, marked only by a high vapor trail and the lights of orbital habitats. Gently, Phillida pulled Lieserl's hand down from her face, and, cupping her chin, tipped her face flower-like towards the sun. The star's light seemed to fill her head. Dazzled, she dropped her eyes and stared at Phillida through a haze of blurred, streaked retinal images. The sun. Single quote. Lieserl, you were constructed. You know that. You're being forced through a human life cycle at hundreds of times the normal pace. A year every day. Approximately, yes. But there is a purpose, Lieserl. A justification. You aren't simply an experiment. You have a mission. She waved her hand at the sprawling, friendly buildings that comprised the house. Most of the people here, particularly the children, don't know anything about you, Lieserl. They have jobs, goals, lives of their own to follow. But they're here for you. Lieserl, the house is here to imprint you with humanity. Your experiences have been designed, George and I were selected, even, to ensure that the first few days of your existence would be as human as possible. The first few days? Suddenly the unknowable future was like a black wall looming towards her. She felt as out of control of her life as if she were a counter on some immense, invisible snakes and ladders board. She lifted her face to the warmth of the sun. What am I? You are artificial, Lieserl. In a few weeks your human shell will become old. You'll be transferred into a new form. Your human body will be discarded. Lieserl, it's so difficult. That moment will seem like a death to me. But it won't be death. It will be a metamorphosis. You'll have new powers, even your awareness will be reconstructed. Lieserl, you'll become the most conscious entity in the solar system. I don't want that. I want to be me. I want my freedom, Phillida. No, Lieserl. You're not free, I'm afraid. You never can be. You have a goal. What goal? Phillida lifted her face to the sun once more. The sun gave us life. Without it, without the other stars, we couldn't survive. We're a strong species. We believe we can live as long as the stars, for tens of billions of years. And perhaps even beyond that. If we're allowed to. But we've had glimpses of the future, the far distant future. Disturbing glimpses. People are starting to plan to assure we're granted our destiny. People are working on projects which will take millions of years to come to fruition. People like those working for Paradoxa. Liesl, you're one of those projects. I don't understand. Phillida took her hand, squeezed it gently. The simple human contact seemed incongruous, the garden around them transient, a chimera, before this talk of mega-years and the future of the species. Liesl, something is wrong with the sun. You have to find out what. The sun is dying. Something, or someone, is killing it. Phillida's eyes were huge before her, staring, probing for understanding. Don't be afraid. My dear, you will live forever. If you want to. And you will see wonders which I can only dream of. Single quote. Liesl stared into her mother's huge, weak eyes. But you don't envy me. Do you, Phillida? No, Phillida said quietly. 2. Louise Ye Monk stood on the weather deck of the SS Great Britain. From here she could see the full length of Brunel's fine steam liner, the polished deck, the skylights, the airy masts with their loops of wire rigging, the single, squat funnel amidships, and beyond the glowing dome which sheltered the old ship, the sky of the solar system's rim loomed like a huge, empty room. Louise still felt a little drunk, sourly now, from the orbiting party she'd left a few minutes earlier. She sub-vocalized a command to send nanobots scouring through her bloodstream. She sobered up fast, with a brief shudder. Mark Bassett Friar Armonk, Louise's ex-husband, stood close by her. They'd left the Great Northern, with its party still in full swing, to come here, too. The surface of Port Saul, in a cramped pod. Mark was dressed in a one-piece jumpsuit of some pastel fabric. The lines of his neck were long and elegant as he turned his head to survey the old ship. Louise was glad they were alone, that none of the Northern's prospective interstellar colonists had decided to follow them down for a last few moments on this outpost of Sol, to reminisce with this fragment of Earth's past, even though reminiscence was part of the reason Louise had had the old ship brought out here in the first place. Mark touched her arm. His palm, through the thin fabric of her sleeve, felt warm, alive. You're not happy, are you? Even at a moment like this? Your greatest triumph. Single quote. She searched his face, seeking out his meaning. He wore his hair shaven, so that his fine, fragile-looking skull showed through his dark skin. His nose was sharp, his lips thin, and his blue eyes, striking in that dark face, were surrounded by a mesh of wrinkles. He'd once told her he'd thought of getting the wrinkles smoothed out. It would be easy enough in the course of OS renewal, but she'd campaigned against it. Not that she'd have cared too much, but it would have taken most of the character out of that elegant face. Most of its patina of time, she thought. I never could read you, she said at last. Maybe that's why we failed in the end. He laughed lightly, a sparkle of intoxication still in his voice. Oh, come on. We lasted 20 years. That's not a failure. Single quote. In a lifetime of 200 years? She shook her head. Look. You ask me about my feelings. Anyone who didn't know you, us, would think you cared. So why do I think that, in some part of your head, you're laughing at me? Single quote. Mark drew his hand away from her arm, and she could almost see the shudders coming down behind his eyes. Because you're an ill-tempered, morose, graceless, oh, and to leave you with it. Anyway, you're right, Louise said at last. What? Single quote. I'm not happy. Although I'm not sure I could tell you why. Mark smiled. The sourceless light of the Britain's dome smoothed away the lines around his eyes. Well, if we're being honest with each other for once, I do kind of enjoy seeing you suffer. Just a bit. But I care as well. Come on, let's walk. He took her arm again, and they walked along the ship's starboard side. The Soles of their shoes made soft sucking sounds as the shoe's limited processors made the soles adhere to and release the deck surface, unobtrusively reinforcing port soles microgravity. The shoes almost got it right. Louise felt herself stumble only a couple of times. Around the ship was a dome of semi-sentient glass, and beyond the dome, beyond the pool of sourceless light which bathed the liner, the landscape of Port Saul stretched to its close crowding horizon. Port Saul was a 100-mile ball of friable rock and water ice, with traces of hydrogen, helium and a few hydrocarbons. It was like a huge comet nucleus. Port Saul's truncated landscape was filled with insubstantial, gossamer forms, sculptures raised from the ancient ice by natural forces reduced to geological slowness by the immense distance of the sun. Port Saul was a Kuiper object. With uncounted companions, it circled the sun. Beyond the orbit of Pluto, shepherded there by resonances of the major planets' gravitational fields. Louise looked back at the Great Britain. Even against the fairy background of Port Saul, still Brunel's ship struck her as a thing of lightness, grace and elegance. She remembered going to see the ship in her dry dock on Earth, now, as then. She compressed her eyes, squinting, trying to make out the form of the thing, the platonic ideal within the iron, which poor old Isambard had tried to make real. The ship was 3,000 tons of iron and wood, but with her slim, sharp curves and fine detail she was like a craft out of fantasy. Louise thought of the gilded decorations and the coat of arms figurehead around the stern, and the simple, affecting symbols of Victorian industry carved into the bow, the coil of rope, the cogwheels, the set square, the wheat sheaf. It was impossible to imagine such a delicate thing braving the storms of the Atlantic. She tilted back her head, and looked for the brightest star in Capricorn that was Sol, all of 4 billion miles away. Surely even a visionary like old Isambard never imagined that his first great ship would make her final voyage across such an immense sea as this. Mark and Louise climbed down a steep staircase amidships to the promenade deck. They strolled along the deck past blocks of tiny cabins towards the engine room bulkhead. Mark ran a fingertip over the surface of a cabin wall as they passed. He frowned, rubbing his fingertips together. The surface feels odd. Not much like wood. It's preserved within a thin shell of semi-sentient plastic, which seals it, nourishes it. Mark, the damn boat was launched in 1843. Over 2,000 years ago. There wouldn't be much left of her without preservation. Anyway, I thought you weren't interested. Single quote. He sniffed. Not really. I'm more interested in why you wanted to come down here, now, in the middle of all the celebrations for the completion of the starship. I try to avoid introspection, she said heavily. Oh, sure. He turned to her, his face picking up the soft glow of the ancient wood. Talk to me, Louise. The bit of me that cares about you is outvoting the bit that enjoys seeing you suffer, just for the moment. She shrugged. She couldn't help sounding sour. You tell me. You always were good at diagnosing the condition of the inside of my head at great and tedious length. Maybe I'm feeling melancholy after completing my work on the Northern. Could that be it, do you think? Maybe I'm going through some equivalent of a post-coital depression. He snorted. With you, it was post, pre and during, frankly. No, I don't think. It's that. And besides, he said slowly, your work on the Northern isn't finished yet. You're planning to leave with her, aren't you? Spend subjective decades hauling her out to Tau Ceti. She heard herself growl. How did you find out about that? No wonder you drove me crazy, all those years. You're too damn interested in me. I'm right, though, aren't I? Single quote. Now they reached the Britons' dining room. It was a fantastic Victorian dream. 12 columns of white and gold, with ornamental capitals, ran down its spine, and the room was lined by 2 sets of 12 more columns each. Doorways between the columns led off to passageways and bedrooms, and the door archways were gilded and surmounted by medallion heads. The walls were lemon yellow, relieved by blue, white and gold. Omnipresent, sourceless light shone from the cutlery and glassware on the 3 long tables. Mark walked across the carpet and ran his hand over a table's gleaming, polished surface. You should do something about this semi-sentient plastic. Have it give the surfaces some semblance of their natural texture. The touch is half the beauty of a thing, Louise. But you always were remote, weren't you? Happy enough with the surface of things, with their look, their outer form. Never interested in touching, and getting closer. Single quote. She ignored that. Brunel had a lot of style, you know. He worked on a tunnel under the Thames, with his father. Single quote. Where? Mark had been born in Port Cassini, Titan. The Thames, a river, in England. Unearth. The tunnel was flooded several times. Once, when it had been pumped out, Brunel threw a dinner party right up against the working face for 50 people. He got the band of the Coldstream Guards too. How interesting, Mark said dryly. Maybe you should put some food on these tables. Why not? It could be preserved by your sentient plastic. You could have segments of dead animals, as devoured by the great Brunel himself. You never did have any taste, Mark. I don't think your mood has anything to do with the completion of the Northern. Then what? He sighed. It's you, of course. It always is. For a long time, while we were together, I thought I understood your motivation. There would always be another huge, beautiful gut ship to build, another immense undertaking to lose yourself in. And since we're all immortal now, thanks to anti-senescence, I thought that would be enough for you. But I was wrong. It isn't like that. Not really. Single quote. Louise was aware of intense discomfort. Somewhere deep within her, she felt she wanted to talk, read a book, slate, bury herself in a virtual anything to drown out his words. You always were smarter than me, Mark. In some ways, yes. Just say what you've got to say, and get it over. You want immortality, Louise. But not the dreary literal immortality of his. Not just a body scouring every few years, but the kind of immortality attained by your idols. He waved a hand. By Brunel, for instance. By achieving something unique, wonderful. And you fear you'll never be able to, no matter how many starships you build. You're damn patronizing, she snapped. The Northern is a great achievement. I know it is. I'm not denying it. He smiled, triumph in his eyes. But I'm right, aren't I? She felt deflated. You know you are. Damn you. She rubbed her eyes. It's the shadow of the future, Mark. A century and a half earlier, the future had invaded the solar system. It had been humanity's own fault. Everyone recognized that. Under the leadership of an engineer called Michael Poole, the Interface Project, a wormhole link to a future a millennium and a half ahead, had been completed. At the time, Louise Ye-R Monk was well established in her chosen field of gutship engineering. At least, as established as any mere 50-year-old kid. In a society increasingly dominated by the as-preserved giants of the recent past. Louise had even worked briefly with Michael Poole himself. Why had Poole's wormhole time link been built? There were endless justifications. What power could a glimpse of the future afford? But the truth was, Louise knew that it had been built for little more than the sheer joy of it. The Interface project came at the end of centuries of expansion for mankind. The solar system had been opened up, first by gut drive vessels and later by wormhole links, and the first gut drive starship fueling port, Port Sol, was already operational. It was difficult now to recapture the mood of those times, Louise thought. Confidence, arrogance. The anthropic theories of cosmological evolution were somewhere near their paradigmatic peak. Some people believed humans were alone in the universe. Others even believed the universe had been designed by some offstage agency, with the sole object of delivering and supporting humans. Given time, humans would do anything, go anywhere, achieve whatever they liked. But Poole's interface had been a bridge to the real future. The incident that followed the opening of the wormhole had been confused, chaotic, difficult to disentangle. But it had been a war, brief, spectacular, like no battle fought in solar space before or since, but a war nevertheless. Future Earth, at the other end of Poole's time bridge, a millennium and a half hence, would be under occupation by an alien species about whom nothing was known save their name, QAX. Rebel humans from the occupation era were pursued back through time, through Poole's interface, by two immense QAX warships. The rebels, with the help of Michael Poole, had destroyed the warships. Then Poole had driven a captured warship into the interface wormhole, to seal it against further invasion. And in the process Poole himself was lost in time. The rebels, stranded in their past, had fled the solar system in a captured gut drive ship, evidently intending to use time dilation effects to erode away the years back to their own era. The system, stunned, slowly recovered. Various bodies, like the paradoxical Egypt, still, after 150 years, combed through the fragments of data from the interface incident, trying to answer the unanswerable. Like, what had truly happened to Michael Poole? It was known that the QAX occupation itself would eventually be lifted, and humanity would resume its expansion, but now more warily, and into a universe known to be populated by hostile competitors. A universe containing, above all, the ZLE. And it was said that before Poole's wormhole path to the future finally closed, some information had been obtained on the far future, of millions of years hence, far beyond the era of the QAX. Louise could see how some such data could be obtained by the flux of high-energy particles from the mouth of the collapsing wormhole, for instance. And the rumors said that the far future, and what it held for mankind, were bleak indeed. Louise and Mark stood on the forecastle deck and looked up towards the sun. The Great Northern, Louise's gut drive starship, passed serenely over their heads, following its stately, 4-hour orbit through the Kuiper object's shallow gravitational well. The Northern's 3-mile-long spine, encrusted with sensors, looked as if it had been carved from glass. The gut drive was embedded in a block of Port Sol ice, a silvery, irregular mass at one end of the spine. The life dome, itself a mile across, was a skull of glass, fixed to the spine's other end. Lights shone from the life dome, green and blue. The dome looked like a bowl full of earth, here on the rim of the system. "It's beautiful," Mark said. "Like a virtual. It's hard to believe it's real." The light from the Britain's dome underlit his face, throwing the fine lines around his mouth into relief. "And it's a good name, Louise. Great Northern. Your starship will head out where every direction is north, away from the sun." Staring up at the shimmering northern now, Louise remembered virtual journeys through ghostly, stillborn craft which had evolved around her as the design software responded to her thoughts. How Brunel would have thrived with modern software, which once again enabled the vision of individuals to dominate such huge engineering projects. And some of those lost ships had been far more elegant and daring than the final design, which had been, as ever, a compromise between vision and economics. And that was the trouble. The real thing was always a disappointment. Louise, you shouldn't fear the future, Mark said. Instantly Louise was irritated. I don't fear it, she said. Lethe, don't you even understand that? It's Michael Poole and his damn interface incident. I don't fear the future. The trouble is, I know it. We all do, Louise, Mark said, his patience starting to sound a little strained. And most of us don't let it affect us. Oh, really? Look at yourself, Mark. What about your hair, for instance? Or, rather, your lack of it. Mark ran a self-conscious hand up and over his scalp. She went on, everyone knows that this modern passion for baldness comes from those weird human rebels from the future, the friends of Wigner. So you can't tell me you're not influenced by knowing what's to come. Your very hairstyle has a statement of, all right, he snapped. All right, you've made your point. You never know when to shut up, you? But Louise, the difference is we aren't all obsessed by the future. Unlike you. He walked away from her, his gait stiff with annoyance. They climbed down into the engine room. Multicolored light filtered down through an immense skylight. 4 inclined cylinders thrust up from the floor of the ship. The pistons stood idle like the limbs of iron giants, and a vast chain girdled the drive machinery. Louise rubbed her chin and stared at the machinery. Obsessed? Mark, the future contains the Zieli, godlike entities so aloof from us that we may never understand what they are trying to achieve, and with technology, with engineering, like magic, they have a hyperdrive. She let her voice soften. Do you understand what that means? It means that somewhere in the universe, now, the damn Zieli are riding around in FTL chariots which make my poor Northern look like a horse-drawn cart. And we believe they have an intrasystem engine, their so-called discontinuity drive, which powers night dark ships with wings like sycamore leaves, hundreds of miles wide. I'm not denying my gut drive module is a beautiful piece of engineering. I'm proud of it. But compared to what we understand of Zieli technology, Mark, it's a damn steam engine. Why, we even use ice as reaction mass. Think of that. What's the point of building something which I know is outdated? Before I even start? Single quote. Mark laid a hand on her shoulder and squeezed. His touch was warm, firm, and, as he'd no doubt intended, disconcertingly intimate. So that's why you're running away. I'd hardly call leaving on a one-way colonizing expedition to Tau Ceti running away. Single quote. Of course it is. Here is where you can achieve things, here, with the resources of a solar system. You're an engineer, damn it. What will you build on? Some planet of Tau Ceti? A real steam engine, maybe. But she struggled to find words that didn't sound, even to her, like self-justifying whines. But maybe that would count for more, in the greater scheme of things, even than a dozen bigger and better Northerns. Do you see? Not really. His voice sounded flat, tired, perhaps he was letting himself sober up. They stood for a while, in a silence broken only by their breathing. Then he said, I'm sorry, Louise. I'm sorry you're letting such moods spoil your night of triumph. But I've had enough. I feel as if I've been listening to that stuff for half my life. As usual, when his mood turned like this, she was filled with regret. She tried to cover his hand, which still lay on her shoulder. Mark. He slid his hand away. I'm going back to the pod, and up to the ship, and I'm going to get a little more drunk. Do you want to come? Single quote. She thought about it. No. Send the pod down again. Some of the cabins here are made up. I can. There was a sparkling in the air before him. She stumbled back, disconcerted. Mark moved closer to her to watch. Pixels, thumbnail cubes of light, tumbled over each other, casting glittering highlights from Brunel's ancient machinery. They coalesced abruptly into the life-size, semi-transparent virtual image of a human head, round, bald, cheerful. The face split into a grin. Louise. Sorry to disturb you. Gillibrand. What in Lethe do you want? I thought you'd be unconscious by now. Sam Gillibrand, 40 going on 150, was Louise's chief assistant. I was. But my nanobots were hooked up to the comms panel. They sobered me up fast when the message came in. Damn them. Gillibrand looked cheerful enough. Oh, well, I'll just have it all to do again, and the comms panel? What was the message, Sam? Single quote. Gillibrand's grin became uncertain. City Hall. There's been a change to the flight plan. Gillibrand's voice was high, heavily accented mid-American, and not really capable of conveying much drama. And yet Louise felt herself shudder when Gillibrand said, "We're not going to Tau Ceti after all." The old woman leaned forward in her seat, beside Kevin Scholes. The surface of the sun, barely 10,000 miles below the clear-walled cabin of the Lightrider, was a floor across the universe. The photosphere was a landscape, encrusted by granules each large enough to swallow the Earth, and with the chromosphere, the 1,000-mile thick outer atmosphere, a thin haze above it all. Scholes couldn't help but stare at his companion. Her posture was stiff, and her hands, neatly folded in her lap, over her seatbelt, were gaunt, the skin pocked by liver spots, and hanging loosely from the bones. Like gloves, he thought. She wore a simple silver-gray coverall, whose only decoration was a small brooch pinned to the breast. The brooch depicted a stylized snake entwined around a golden ladder. The little ship passed over a photosphere granule. Scholes watched absently as it unfolded beneath them. Hot hydrogen welled up from the solar interior at a speed of half a mile a second, then spread out across the photosphere surface. This particular fount of gas was perhaps 1,000 miles across, and, in its photosphere-hugging orbit, the Lightrider was traveling so rapidly that it had passed over the granule in a few minutes. And Scholes saw as he looked back that the granule was already beginning to disintegrate, the hydrogen spill at its heart dwindling. Individual granules persisted less than 10 minutes, on average. How beautiful this is, his companion said, gazing down at the sunscape. And how complex, how intricate, like some immense machine, perhaps, or even a world. She turned to him, her mouth surrounded by its dense web of wrinkles, folded tight. I can imagine whiling away my life, just watching the slow evolutions of that surface. Single quote. Scholes looked across the teeming sunscape. The photosphere was a massive, ponderous motion, resembling the surface of a slowly boiling liquid. The granules, individual convective cells, were themselves grouped into loose associations, supergranules, tens of thousands of miles across, roughly bounded by thin, shifting walls of stable gas. As he watched, one granule exploded, its material bursting suddenly across the solar surface. Neighboring granules were pushed aside, so that a glowing, unstructured scar was left on the photosphere, a scar which was slowly healed by the eruption of new granules. Scholes studied his companion. The sunlight underlaid her face, deepening the lines and folds of loose flesh there. It made her look almost demonic, or like something out of a distant, unlamented past. She'd fallen silent now, watching him. Some response was expected, and he sensed that his customary glib flippancy, which usually passed for conversation in this solar habitat, wouldn't do. Not for her. He summoned up a smile, with some difficulty. Yes, it's beautiful. But Scholes had spent much of the last 5 years within a million miles of the sun's glowing surface, but even so had barely started to become accustomed to the eternal presence of the star. It's impossible to forget it's there. Even when I'm in Thoth, with the walls opaque, when I could really be anywhere in the system, I guess. He hesitated, suddenly embarrassed. Her cold, rheumy eyes were on him, analytical. I'm sorry. I don't know how to explain it any better. Single quote. Was there a hint of a smile on that devastated face? You needn't be self-conscious. Kevin Scholes had volunteered for this assignment, a simple 3-hour orbital tour with this mysterious woman who, a few days earlier, had been brought to Thoth, the free-fall habitat at the center of the Wormhole Project. It should have been little more than a sightseeing jaunt, and a chance to learn more about this ancient woman, and perhaps about the true goals of Paradox's Wormhole Project itself. And besides, it was a break from his own work. Scholes was supervising the assembly of one vertex of a wormhole interface from exotic matter components. When the wormhole was complete, one of its pair of tetrahedral interfaces would be left in close orbit around the Sun. The other, packed with an ambitious AI complex, would be dropped into the Sun itself. The work was well paid, though demanding, but it was dull, routine, lacking fulfillment. So a break was welcome. But he had not expected to be so disconcerted by this extraordinary woman. He tried again. You see, we're all scientists or engineers here, he said. A sense of wonder isn't a prerequisite for a job on this project, it's probably a handicap, actually. But that's a star out there, after all, nearly 1 million miles across, 5 light seconds, and with the mass of 300,000 Earths. Even when I can't see it, I know it's there. It's like a psychic pressure, perhaps. She nodded and turned her face to the Sun once more. Which is why we find speculation about its destruction so extraordinarily distressing. And, of course, to some extent we are actually within the body of the Sun itself. Isn't that true? I guess so. There's no simple definition of where the Sun ends, there's just a fall-off of density, steep at first, then becoming less dramatic once you're outside the photosphere. Let me show you. He touched his data slate, and the semi-sentient hull suppressed the photosphere's glow. In its new false colors, the sunscape became suffused with deep crimsons and purples. The granules seethed like the clustering mouths of undersea volcanoes. My word, she murmured. It's like a landscape from a medieval hell. Single quote. Look up, Scholes said. She did so, and gasped. The chromosphere was a soft, featureless mist around the ship. And the corona, the Sun's outer atmosphere, extending many solar diameters beyond the photosphere, was a cathedral of gas above them, easily visible now that the photosphere light was suppressed. There were ribbons, streamers of high density. In that gas, it was like an immense, slow explosion all around them, expanding as if to fill space. There's so much structure, she said. She stared upwards, her watery eyes wide and unblinking. Skulls felt disquieted by her intensity. He restored the transparency of the hull, so that the corona was overwhelmed once more. A sunspot, deep black at its heart, giving an impression of a wound in the sun's hide, of immense depth, unfolded beneath them, ponderously. "We seem to be traveling so slowly," she said. He smiled. "We're in free orbit around the sun. We're actually traveling at 300 miles a second." He saw her eyes widen. He said gently, "I know. It takes a little while to get used to the scale of the sun. It's not a planet. If the Earth were at the center of the sun, the whole of the moon's orbit would be contained within the sun's bulk." Single quote. They were directly over the spot now. Its central umbra was like a wound in the sun's glowing flesh, deep black, with the penumbra a wide, gray bruise around it. This was the largest of a small, interconnected family of spots, skulls. Saw now, they looked like splashes of paint against the photosphere, and their penumbrae were linked by causeways of grayness. The spot complex passed beneath them, a landscape wrought in shades of gray. "It's like a tunnel," Lee Searle said. "I imagine I can see into it, right down into the heart of the sun." "That's an illusion, I'm afraid. The spot is dark only by contrast with the surrounding regions. If a major spot complex could be cut out of the sun and left hanging in space, it would be as bright as the full moon, seen from Earth. But still, the illusion of depth is startling." Single quote. Now the spot complex was passing beneath them, rapidly becoming foreshortened. Skulls said uncertainly, "Of course you understand that what you see of the sun, here, is a false color rendering by the hull of the Lightrider. Rider's hull is actually almost perfectly reflective. Excess heat is dumped into space. With high-energy lasers fixed to the hull, the Rider refrigerates itself effectively. In fact, if you could see the ship from outside, it would actually be glowing more brightly than the photosphere itself." Skulls was uncomfortably aware that he was jabbering. "I think I follow." She waved her claw-like hand, delicately, at the glowing surface. "But the features are real, of course. Like the spot complex." "Yes. Yes, of course." Lethe, he thought suddenly. Am I patronizing her? His brief had been to show this strange old woman the sights, to give her the VIP tour. But he knew nothing about her. It was quite possible she knew far more about the subjects he was describing than he did. The paradoxical collegiate was notoriously secretive about the goals of this solar wormhole project, and the role the old woman would play in it. Although everyone knew, from the way she had been handled since arriving in near solar space, as if she was as fragile and precious as an eggshell, that this woman was somehow the key to the whole thing. But how much did she know? He watched her bird-like face carefully. The way her gray hair had been swept back into a small, hard bun made her strong-nosed face even more gaunt and threatening than it might otherwise have been. She asked, "And is this refrigeration process how the wormhole probe is going to work, to become able to penetrate the sun itself?" He hesitated. "Something like it, yes. The key to refrigerating a volume is to suck heat out of the volume faster than it's allowed in. We'll be taking solar heat away from the AI complex out through the wormhole, and dumping it outside the sun itself. Actually, we're planning to use that energy as a secondary power source for Thoth." She shifted in her chair, stiff and cautious, as if afraid of breaking something. "Dr. Scholes, tell me, will we be leaving free fall?" The question was surprising. He looked at her. "During this flight, in the Lightrider." She returned his look calmly, waiting. We're actually in free orbit around the sun, this close to the surface. The period is about 3 hours. We'll make a complete orbit. Then we'll climb back out to Thoth. But we'll proceed the whole way at low acceleration. You should barely feel a thing. Why do you ask? He hesitated. Are you uncomfortable? No. But I would be if we started to ramp up the Gs. I'm a little more fragile than I used to be, you see. Her tone was baffling, self-deprecating, wistful. Perhaps with a hint of resentment. He nodded and turned away, unsure how to respond. Oh, dear. Unexpectedly, she was smiling, revealing small, yellow gold teeth. I'm sorry, Dr. Scholes. I suspect I'm intimidating you. A little, yes. He grinned. You really don't know what to make of me, do you? He spread his hands. The trouble is, frankly, I'm not sure how much you know. He hesitated. I don't want to feel I'm patronizing you, Don't feel that. Unexpectedly she let her hand rest on his. Her fingers felt like dried twigs, but her palm was surprisingly warm, leathery. You're fulfilling the request I made for this trip very well. Assume I know nothing. You can treat me as an empty-headed tourist. Her smile turned into a grin, almost mischievous. Suddenly she seemed much less alien in Scholes' eyes. As ignorant as a visiting politician, or paradox a high-up, even. Tell me about sunspots, for instance. He laughed. All right. To understand that, you need to know how the sun is put together. The sun was a thing of layers, like a Chinese box. At the sun's heart was an immense fusion reactor, extending across 200,000 miles. This core region, contained within just a quarter of the sun's diameter, provided nearly all the sun's luminosity, the energy which caused the sun to shine. Beyond the fusing core, the sun consisted of a thinning plasma. Photons, packets of radiation emitted from the core, worked their way through this radiative layer, on average traveling no more than an inch before bouncing off a nucleus or electron. It could take an individual photon millions of years to work its way through the crowd to the surface of the sun. Moving outwards from the core, the density, temperature and pressure of the plasma fell steadily, until at last 4/5 of the way to the surface, electrons could cling to nuclei to form atoms, and, unlike the bare nuclei of the plasma, the atoms were able to absorb the energy of the photons. It was as if the photons, after struggling out from the fusing center, had hit a brick wall. All of their energy was dumped into the atoms. The gas above the wall responded, like a pan of water heated from below, by convecting, with hot material rising and dragging down cooler material from above. The wormhole probe, with its fragile cargo, would be able to penetrate as far as the bottom of this convective zone, 20% of the way towards the center of the sun. She nodded. And the photosphere which we see, with its granules and supergranules, is essentially the top layer of the convective zone. It's like the surface of your pan of boiling water. Yes. And it's the properties of the material in the convective zone that cause sunspots. The convective zone matter was highly charged. The sun's magnetic field was intense, and its flux tubes, each 100 yards across, became locked into the charged material. The sun's rotation spread the frozen in flux lines, stretching them around the sun's interior like bands of elastic. The tubes became tangled into ropes, disturbed by bubbles of rising gas and twisted by convection. Kinks in the tangled ropes became buoyant enough to float up to the surface and spread out, causing spots and spot groups. She smiled as he spoke. You know, I feel as if I'm returning to my childhood. I studied solar physics intensely, she said. And a lot else, besides. I remember doing it. But, she sighed, I seem to retain less and less. The sun is my life's work, you see, Dr. Scholes. I've known it since I was born. I once knew much about the sun. And in the future, she went on ambiguously, I shall once again know a great deal. More, perhaps, than anyone who has yet lived. He decided to be honest with her. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Single quote. No. No, I don't suppose it does, she said sharply. But that doesn't matter, drive. Scholes. Your brief is to do just what you've been doing, to show me the sights. To let me feel the sun from a human perspective. A human perspective. Now she turned and looked directly into his eyes, her gaze, watery as it was open and disconcerting, searing. But your curiosity about my role isn't what's throwing you off balance. Is it? It's my age. She grinned again, deliberately, it seemed to him, showing her grotesque, yellowed teeth. I've seen you studying me, from the corner of your eye. Don't worry, Kevin Scholes, I don't take offense. My age is the subject. You've been politely skirting since I climbed aboard this flying refrigerator of yours. He felt resentful. You're mocking me. She snorted. Of course I am. But it's the truth, isn't it? He tried not to let his anger build. What reaction do you expect? Honesty at last. I expect nothing less than your rather morbid fascination, of course. She raised her hands and steadied them, as if they were artifacts separate from her body. She turned them around, flexing her fingers. How awful it is that this aging was once the lot of all of humanity, this slow disintegration into decay, physical and mental. Especially the physical, actually. My body seems to crowd out my awareness. Sometimes I've time for nothing else but to cater to its pressing, undignified needs. She frowned. But perhaps, as treatment has robbed our species of rather more than it has given us. After all, even the most vain, or most attention-seeking, refuse to be as frozen it more than, say, physical 60. So meaningful interaction is restricted to physical range of a mere 6 decades. How sad. Single quote. He took a breath. But you must be physical 80. Her mouth twitched. That's not a bad guess, for someone who's never met an old person before. Unless you've ever encountered an unfortunate individual for whom his treatment has failed to take. These are humans in their natural state, if you think about it, but our society treats them as ill, to be feared, shunned. Gently, he asked, is that what's happened to you? Single quote. Failed his treatments? Her papery cheeks trembled briefly, and again he perceived resentment, a deep anger, just under her abrasive, disconcerting surface. No. Not exactly. He touched her arm. Look there. Ahead of us. There was a structure before them, looming out of the flat infinite horizon. Rising from the photosphere itself. It was like a viaduct, a series of arches, loops of crimson glowing gas which strode across the solar surface. Once again he heard her gasp. He checked his data slate. Prominences. The whole structure is 100,000 miles long, 20,000 high. He glanced up and checked their heading. We're only 10,000 miles above the surface ourselves. We're going to pass through one of those arches. She clapped her hands in delight, and suddenly she seemed astonishingly, unnervingly young, a child trapped in a decaying husk of a body, he thought. Soon the arch through which they would pass was huge before them, and the mouths of the others began to close up, foreshortened. In this landscape of giants, Skulls found he had trouble visualizing the scale of the structures. Their approach seemed to take forever, yet still they grew, thrusting out of the sun like the dreams of some insane engineer. Now he could make out detail. There were places where the arch was not complete, and he could see knots of higher density in the coronal gas which flowed, glowing, down the magnetically shaped flanks towards pools of light at the feet of the arch. But despite all this, the illusion of artifice persisted, making the structure still more intimidating. At last the arch swept over them, immense, aloof, grand. 5,000 miles thick, he said slowly. Just think, you could hang the earth up there, at the apex of that arch, like a Christmas tree ornament. She snorted, and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. He looked at her curiously. She was, he realized slowly, giggling. They passed through the arch. The vast sculpture of gas receded slowly behind them. Skulls checked his data slate. We've almost completed our orbit. 3 million miles of a solar great circle traversed in 3 hours. Single quote. So our journey's nearly done. She folded her hands neatly in her lap once more, and turned her face to the clear wall. Corona light played around her profile, making her look remote, surprisingly young. He felt suddenly moved by her, by this lonely, bitter woman, isolated by her agent fragility from the rest of mankind. And, he suspected obscurely, isolated by some much more dramatic secret. He tried to reassure her. Another hour and you'll be safely inside the habitat. You'll be a lot more comfortable there. And she turned to him. She wasn't smiling, but her face seemed to have softened a little, as if she understood what he was trying to do. Again she reached out and touched the back of his hand, and the sudden human contact was electric. Thank you for your patience, Dr. Skulls. I've not given you an easy time, have I? He frowned, troubled. I don't think I've been patient at all, actually. Oh, but you have. His curiosity burned within him, like the sun's fusion core, illuminating everything he saw. You're at the heart of all this, aren't you? The Paradoxa Project, I mean. I don't understand what your role is. But that's the truth, isn't it? She said nothing, but let her hand remain on his. He frowned. She seemed so fragile. And how do you feel about it? Single quote. How do I feel? She closed her eyes. Do you know, I'm not sure if anyone has asked me that before. How do I feel? She sighed, raggedly. I'm scared. Drive. Skulls. That's how I feel. He let his fingers close around hers. There was a subtle push in the base of his spine, and the sound of the Light Rider's drive was a deep, low vibration, a seismic rumble he felt deep within the fabric of his body. Slowly, the little ship climbed away from the sun's boiling surface.